Welcome to episode 2 on the Irish Magdalene Laundries. I just need to put a disclaimer here. This episode is created for educational purposes. I have researched and gathered information from books, documentaries, oral records from the Magdalene Laundry survivors, official reports, websites, Justice for Magdalene's research, and more. I do not mean to insult or disrespect anyone I speak about here. And I also just need to warn you, I will be speaking about institutional abuse here. So if that's something you feel might upset you, perhaps I'll see you in the next episode. So with that said, welcome back to A Drop in the Ocean.
He said it's just a drop in the ocean. Why would anyone notice? What a strange thing to say, a ripple away from ulterior motives. Just a drop in the ocean. What a horrible notion that I'm just a drip in the wave of your much harder day in your life with your way bigger problems.
This week in Ireland, we lost an unbelievably gifted musician, a child abuse advocate, and a survivor of a Magdalene training school, Sinead O'Connor. The country, and indeed much further afield than Ireland, are both celebrating the life of and mourning the loss of Sinead. Sinead was outspoken. She didn't believe in leaving well enough alone, as is a strong tradition here in Ireland, just not a good one. She was vocal about her mental health. She struggled with bipolar disorder throughout the years. As a young teenager, her father placed her in on Grianan training centre for girls for 18 months, labelled a troubled child, having been caught shoplifting. She told us she did get a good education there. We know it was not uncommon for girls or women suffering from mental health issues to end up in the Magdalene institutions. This training centre, where troubled children would be sent, was to give them a basic education and to also teach them how to cook, clean, sew, become a good homemaker. On Grianan is located on the same grounds as the High Park Magdalene Laundry, the one which was last to close in Ireland, closing to the public in 1996. In latter years, it has finally been acknowledged and accepted that many girls confined to on Grianan were sent every day, forced to work without pay in the laundries, alongside the women incarcerated in the Magdalene Laundries. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, Sinead was vocal about many things, way before it was considered a right or even acceptable in Ireland, especially for a woman. But it didn't stop Sinead. She spoke about Ireland's little secrets. She is infamous for tearing up a poster of the Pope in 1992 on Saturday Night Live, which she told us afterwards was in part because of the time she spent in on Grianan, and in part because of the ongoing clerical child sex abuse scandal in Ireland. My thoughts are with Sinead's family, who wish for privacy at this extremely difficult time. One of the things I mentioned in the previous episode was that the Irish Human Rights Commission had become involved in 2010 when Justice for Magdalenes had lodged a complaint on behalf of the Magdalene survivors. So let me quickly just go through that for you. And this is taken directly from jfmresearch.com. Dr. Maeve O'Rourke argued that the women's treatment amounted to slavery, servitude and/or forced labour, as defined by international law. Following on from this, she argued that the state had violated its positive obligations under several international treaties, the European Convention on Human Rights, and arguably the Irish Constitution, to protect women and girls from the treatment to which they had been subjected. It did not matter how the women or girls entered the laundries, for example, at the hands of family members rather than the state, because the international legal obligations of states regarding slavery, servitude, and forced labour were designed to ensure the suppression of non-state actors' use of these forms of exploitation. Furthermore, the state's legal obligations to prevent and suppress slavery, servitude, and forced labour dated back to the 1930s. This was not a case of applying today's legal standards to judge the state's past conduct unfairly. On the 9th of November 2010, the Irish Human Rights Commission published an assessment of the human rights issues arising in relation to the Magdalene Laundries, calling on the state to establish a statutory inquiry into abuses in the Magdalene Laundries. On the same day, the Dáil held an adjourned debate where Tom Kitt, Michael Kennedy and Kathleen Lynch, TDs, called for an apology and reparation for Magdalene survivors.
And if anything cries to the heaven for revenge and for to be put right, then this story cries to the heavens. And yet these people don't ask for revenge, nor does he. They simply ask that the terrible wrong that was done to them be recognised, and the state stands up and says, we were wrong and we are sorry for what you have suffered. And I don't make the distinction between those who were put in as a direct responsibility of the state and those who were put in by society in all its forms, whether it was the busybody on the street, the social worker, the local priest, whatever. Why didn't the agencies of the state who were charged with the responsibility in relation to these women not go into these institutions and say, are you here of your own free will? How long are you supposed to be here for? Would you like to leave? None of us did that. Even those who were put in by their families, by society, by whatever, when they did manage to escape, and it was escape, they were captured by the police and returned. And the state is as culpable as the institutions in which these women were held. It's as culpable because the state allowed it to continue. The state allowed it to continue. And I would ask those religious institutions, because we're not here seeking revenge. These women are not seeking revenge. Their children are not seeking revenge. What they are seeking is a recognition of who they were and what their lives were. And they don't have that because there is a blanket refusal to release records. And that needs to happen. And I know that within these institutions, there are many fine people. This cannot go on another generation. This must be dealt with. And as long as it's not dealt with, it will continue. We may not be here, but someone else will be. Someone else will be. And I'm asking the minister tonight, go back to Cabinet Minister. Tell the people who sit around that table, this can go on no longer. We have dealt with one awful segment of our history, and this is an outstanding part of our history that we need to deal with. We either deal with it now or we will deal with it in the future. But one way or another, we will deal with it. And I'm asking you, stand up and on behalf of the state, say we are sorry. It shouldn't have happened and we shouldn't have allowed it to continue. And after that, we will deal with everything else. Thank you.
The government, in response, highlighted that the IHRC had not sought information or observations from the numerous government departments concerned or from the religious congregations, the reputations of which are at issue. Noted that the Human Rights Commission did not make a definite finding that there were human rights violations, emphasised the cost to the state of the Commission to inquire into child abuse and redress for industrial and reformatory school survivors, and stated that the number of women who entered the Magdalene Laundries through the criminal justice system was small, and it is worth noting that no complaints have been received from any of these women. I think this needs to be addressed here. This comment, no complaints have been received, or If you remember the Irish State's representative in the Swiss meeting with the UNCAT,
They have been invited to make complaints to our police force,
the survivors were finding it next to impossible to complain or go through the criminal justice system. Why? Well, here are some reasons. These women are survivors of abuse. Physical, emotional, psychological, institutional abuse with continuing effects. To go through the criminal justice system, they had no legal aid. Going to court could incur huge costs not available to them. A statute of limitations did apply, and the women were limited due to lack of access to records. You can read so much more about all of this, everything I'm talking about, in this book, Ireland and the Magdalene Laundries, A Campaign for Justice. The Irish Human Rights Commission believed the women. Labour women believed the women. The National Women's Council for Ireland believed the women. Since 2010, a cross-party ad hoc committee by TDs and senators believed the women. Remember the online petition. Many people at this point believed the women. But time was of the essence. The survivors of the Magdalene Laundries were ageing, many of them in ill health. 3 that were known to Justice for Magdalenes at the time were dying of cancer. And also without education, work skills, life skills, and with psychological illnesses and physical illnesses, the survivors were struggling in a number of ways, including financially, which was obstructing them getting proper health care, proper housing. Redress was crucial and urgent. In March 2011, Conal O'Flaherty, an Irish journalist, linked below, writes on WordPress, the government were conscious of the danger of redress. The admission is made in a March 2011 Department of Justice draft memorandum for the government, seeking permission to establish an interdepartmental committee to review a November 2010 Irish Human Rights Commission report on the Magdalene Laundries. Released under the Freedom of Information Act, it states that the then Justice Minister Alan Shatter was conscious of the danger of redress and of Finance Minister Michael Noonan's view that proposals raised in an earlier memo would very likely generate pressure for opening redress. Mr. Shatter felt an interdepartmental committee, which he proposed be headed by his department, would strengthen the position of the government in dealing with ongoing campaign. The Department of Justice memo states categorically that despite various documentaries and the report of the Irish Human Rights Commission, the state had no case to answer in respect of the Magdalene Laundries. It says government departments were concerned that engaging with the religious orders might give the impression that the state was accepting responsibility in this area. The department is not aware of any facts that would give rise to state liability or responsibility for abuses in the Magdalene Laundries. If there were any abuses in the Magdalene Laundries, the individual abusers concerned and the religious orders who ran them are responsible. The department is not aware of any facts that would give rise to state liability or responsibility for abuses in Magdalene Laundries. The memo also details Mr. Shatter's scathing opinion of the IHRC report on the laundries. It states the then Justice Minister had serious reservations about the methodology, accuracy and conclusions. Of most concern is the lack of balance and any evidence to support the conclusions. The IHRC report is effectively based on allegations put forward by Justice for Magdalenes, and no effort was made to obtain clarification, information or observations from the state, or apparently the religious orders, on any of the issues raised. Following the recommendation to the state from the Irish Human Rights Commission, nothing further happened. No statutory inquiry, no apology, no redress. As mentioned in the previous episode, following a complaint lodged by Justice for Magdalenes in 2011, the United Nations Committee Against Torture also believed the women. In response to the Irish state's negligence, the United Nations Committee Against Torture recommended that the state party should institute prompt, independent and thorough investigations into all allegations of torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, that they prosecute and punish the perpetrators with penalties commensurate with the gravity of the offences committed, and ensure that all victims obtain redress and have an enforceable right to compensation, including the means for as full a rehabilitation as possible. There would be a 1-year follow-up by the United Nations Committee Against Torture. Following the IHRC's recommendation and the United Nations Committee Against Torture's recommendation, within 10 days the Irish state formed an interdepartmental committee. This was not an independent committee as recommended by the UN. This interdepartmental committee was not to investigate any allegations of torture or other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. It was a government interdepartmental committee, given the task of establishing the facts of state involvement with the Magdalene Laundries. As remember, the Irish state were still insisting we had nothing to do with them. They were privately run by the 4 religious orders. The state cannot be held responsible in any way for anything surrounding them. Hence, the Magdalene Laundries were excluded from the remit of the Commission to inquire into child abuse upon its establishment in 2006, and subsequently from the jurisdiction of the Residential Institutions Redress Board. This was very puzzling to a lot of people. If you remember, we spoke previously about the years of interaction between both the survivors and Justice for Magdalene's group with the state. For example, Professor James Smith in 2009 presenting archival evidence of state involvement. But for some reason the state, they just still didn't believe that they had been involved. So why do you think that is? I will go through the reasons I could kind of think of later, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Although do remember to keep it kind so that the comments are allowed. With the liberation, the chairman of this interdepartmental committee was Senator Martin McAleese, the former President Mary McAleese's husband. As it was thought, him being a religious himself, he was the most likely person to persuade the religious orders to hand over some records, because so far they had refused. And he was successful in getting them to hand over records for the first time, with the promise that all records would be returned to them and all copies destroyed. The Interdepartmental Committee consisted of 6 serving civil servants, Senator Martin McAleese as the chair, and Nuala Ní Forchearta, a civil servant who acted as the report's analyst and drafter. The interim report was released in 2011. At this stage, again, Justice for Magdalene's urged Senator McAleese to try get a formal apology for the women. Justice for Magdalene's and the survivors of the Magdalene Laundries anticipated a state apology, as it would be now certainly known within the government circles, even just from the interim report, that the Irish state were heavily involved in the Magdalene Laundries. But still no apology, still no redress. Justice for Magdalene's voiced its concerns to the government and to the United Nations Committee Against Torture in a follow-up report in May 2012, that the Interdepartmental Committee did not meet the state's human rights obligations to investigate the Magdalene Laundry's abuse due to its lack of independence, limited remit, lack of terms of reference, lack of statutory powers to compel evidence, lack of public hearings or access to evidence for survivors or representative groups, lack of authority to make recommendations and decision not to issue a public invitation to submit evidence. Of grave concern, in addition, was the Interdepartmental Committee's decision that it would destroy all copies and return all of the evidence obtained from the religious orders at the conclusion of its work. But Justice for Magdalene's continued working with the IDC in good faith.
The Justice for Magdalene's campaign has discovered that women were transferred from state-funded mother and baby homes to Magdalene Laundries, where they were held against their will and without their children. The campaign says the new evidence strengthens the case for an immediate state apology and for compensation.
Last year, the UN Committee Against Torture strongly criticised the government's failure to apologise to and compensate former detainees of the state's Catholic-run Magdalene Laundries. Now, the Justice for Magdalene's campaign has found new evidence that state-funded mother and baby homes transferred women to the laundries.
The transfer of women from state-licensed, state-funded mother and baby homes into the Magdalene Laundries across an array of institutions in County Tipperary, in Dublin, from Tuam in Galway.
Today, the campaign gave some 500 pages of testimony gathered in recent months from 13 survivors to the Magdalene's Committee, which was established by the government in response to the UN's criticisms. One witness who allowed her testimony to be read was given the pseudonym Attracta.
She was put into High Park Magdalene Laundry from a Sisters of Mercy state-funded orphanage for stealing an apple, although she says she merely picked it up off the ground. And she remained there for 14 years, having been put in at the age of 17.
Justice for Magdalene's acknowledges the important work being done by Senator Martin McAleese at the request of the government to ascertain the exact nature of the state's involvement with the laundries. But it says that should not impede access by the hundreds of women involved to an apology and redress in the twilight of their lives. The Department of Justice responded by saying the government would decide its course of action after considering and publishing Dr. McAleese's report this summer. Joe Little, RT News, at the former Magdalene Laundry in Donnybrook, Dublin.
The IDC's final report was published on the 5th of February 2013. The report was called The Report of the Interdepartmental Committee to Establish the Facts of State Involvement with the Magdalene Laundries. It is also known as the McAleese Report or the IDC Report, as I will be referring to it here. All files received by the committee during this inquiry were returned to the religious orders and all copies were destroyed. Senator Martin McAleese resigned 4 days before the report was published. The survivors were not in agreement with everything in the IDC report, nor were Justice for Magdalene's, nor families or friends of the survivors. But they were all thrilled that it finally, officially confirmed their long-proclaimed state involvement and eagerly awaited the state apology. The then Taoiseach Enda Kenny refused to give the apology that day. Here are some of the survivors on primetime TV that night.
The Magdalene Laundry survivors get their report, but why no apology? The long-awaited report from the Senator Martin McAleese Committee on the state's involvement in the Magdalene Laundries. The report found significant state involvement in the placing of over 2,000 women in the 10 nationwide institutions since 1922. But to the surprise of some today, the Taoiseach didn't give an apology on behalf of the state. In a moment, we'll be talking to some of the women and their families who were placed in these most controversial institutions on their reaction to the report. But first, Tanya Sillam examines the key contents of today's report.
If the history of Irish institutions has been hard to address, the Magdalene Laundries has been hardest.
We were incarcerated in these places, worked our backs off and locked away, and nobody knew we even existed.
Ignored by previous state inquiries into residential abuse, survivors had no pay, no compensation and no pension contributions.
I certainly would like an apology from the Sisters of Charity, because I suffered all my life because I did not get any schooling.
But today, with less than 1,000 survivors still alive, the official report appeared to lay political responsibility for the laundries firmly at the door of the state. Mary Merritt is 82 years old, but despite her age, she's still haunted by the 14 years she spent in a Magdalene Laundry.
I wouldn't have got 14 years for murder. And that's the way I felt about it when I came out about it.
I can't sleep at night to this day when I think about it.
Today, the Taoiseach didn't apologise directly, though he did say he was sorry it had taken until now for a report to be published and that the state should provide for these women, though he didn't say how.
And I want to see that those women who are still with us, that we should see that the state provides for them with the very best of facilities and supports that they need in their lives.
And that report from Tanya Sillam. I want to go to people who are involved in all of this. Maureen Sullivan, you went into the Good Shepherd Magdalene Laundry in New Ross. Isn't that so? What age were you?
12.
You were put there by your own family, though. You weren't one of those put there by the state.
No, I wasn't put there by my own family. I was put there by a nun and a priest in Carlow. Suggested and told my mother that if she sent me there, I'd get a good education because I was being abused in the home. My mother trusted these people.
She trusted them?
Yeah.
What happened to you there? You were in that place for, what, 2 years and then?
And then I was moved on to another laundry in Athy, and then I was moved on to a laundry in the blind school in Merriam.
When you saw the report today, I know you haven't had a chance to go through 1,000 pages of it, nor indeed have any of us. What was your initial reaction?
Well, I thought that it was great that they proved that the state was involved. I was disappointed that they were saying that there was no abuse there. I mean, there was no sexual abuse that I've seen of, but physical.
They said no physical either.
Yeah, no, well, there was. I seen it. I got beaten up myself when I said I was going to tell my mother that I wasn't going to school. 2 nuns beat me up.
What do you think of the notion that this was a different time? I mean, the Taoiseach referred to Ireland, I'm paraphrasing, as being a pretty hard place in those days.
Yeah, well, I wonder if he was in one of them places, would he put it down as the Times?
Yeah. The Good Shepherd sisters today in a statement.
We were adopted, myself and my twin, from my mother was in a Magdalene Laundry, and we were born in a mother and baby home in 1972. And when we were aged 23, we were reunited. So the last time she had seen us before that was when we were 7 weeks old, and she was breastfeeding us, and we were just snatched away one evening, and she didn't see us for another 23 years until we met at the Gresham Hotel.
How did you find her? Was she aware of who you are? Had she become institutionalised?
Incredibly institutionalised. When we met Margaret, she was 42 years old, but she was extremely childlike, and she had no idea how her babies were born. And in fact, when the social worker approached her to say that her daughters had traced her twin daughters, she didn't remember that she had any children.
And do you think she was always this way, that she was probably intellectually challenged even when she had the twins?
There was a measurement of her IQ taken when she was 13. She was raised in the industrial school system, so she was inside from age 2 to age 51 when she left in a coffin. So her IQ was measured at age 13 and assessed at being an IQ of 50, and she was sent to a special school. And she was certified, and I have the records, as being unfit for education but fit for work. So she was sentenced to a labour camp.
Maeve O'Rourke. Maeve, you've been very impressive as a legal advisor. What's your own view today on both the report and, I suppose, the government response?
Well, I do not understand the hold-up with the apology today. I don't believe, Minister, that today is the first time anyone in Cabinet knew what was in that report. We have to remember that all of the members of the committee, apart from Senator McAleese, came from the highest echelons of all of the departments that were directly involved in the laundry's abuse. It has been accepted for a long time that these were abusive institutions, and the idea that they were not physically abusive, this thing that's coming out from this report, I think is an outrage. Martin McAleese did not refute that the women earned no money and that they were locked in. He spoke at the vast majority of girls and women never knowing when they would get out, if ever, and if ever they would see their families again. That was not refuted. If unpaid labour behind locked doors is not physical abuse, I do not know what is. And this committee was given one job. It had been accepted that these were abusive institutions. In the Ryan report, it had been accepted there was a chapter on abuse in laundries, and the government had seen testimony from women and in documentaries. It had been accepted that they were abusive, and the only thing that was left to establish was whether the state was responsible. It has been firmly established now that the state was responsible, and Minister, I do not understand the hold-up. You said yourself another thing that the report established was not just that the state was responsible for a quarter of the women, but that laundry inspectors were routinely inspecting these laundries, that there were state contracts with the laundries. That, in my legal opinion, and as a fact, amounts to state responsibility for every single girl and woman who went in there. The state oversaw this system and didn't do anything to stop it. And Minister, you said when the Irish Human Rights Commission's report came out in 2010, you said yourself there should be no distinction between women and girls who went in at the hands of their families or at the hands of the state. And you said this needs to be sorted, and it needs to be sorted now because it needs to be sorted.
Okay, let the Minister come back on that.
Yeah, it's just, could I just say that, you know, the Cabinet saw the report for the first time today, Maeve. You know, I don't know how you make the assumption that we'd seen it in advance of that, because that's not true. They simply saw the report today when Martin McAleese presented it.
On Maeve's final point there?
On her final point is, yes, this has to be sorted. A knee-jerk reaction at this stage is not what we want. We want a fulsome response. For the first time ever, we have a report that gives us the full picture. There is no one disputing that people suffered incredible hardship. No one has ever disputed that. And we really need to sit down now and think about how we're going to respond to this.
Could you not go into the Taoiseach tomorrow and say, frankly, Taoiseach, I really think we should give an apology? Can you not do that?
Well, no, I can't do it, Miriam.
Well, could you ask him?
Of course you can ask, but we have agreed that it is to be a more fulsome approach in
Last
2
word,
weeks' time.
because I've run out of time. Mary, are you hopeful you may one day get it? You're waiting 50 years, so...
I'm 82.
You don't
so
look
what? Nothing. You don't know what happened to you after that age.
Okay.
You know,
well,
I hope the women get it, and I hope I get it.
Listen, thank you all very much. Pat.
The following morning in the Dáil, TD Mary Lou MacDonald pleaded with the Taoiseach to give the long overdue apology, stating, Taoiseach, you've wrongly asserted here this morning that the McAleese report is the first occasion on which we had documented evidence of the abuses in the Magdalene Laundries, reminding the Taoiseach about the Ryan report back in 2009, detailing forced labour, denial of liberty to women, and significant physical and emotional abuse. Reminding him also of his colleague Alan Shatter, who was now Minister for Justice, who had in the same year been absolutely steadfast in his view, a correct view, that there was irrefutable evidence of state complicity in the Magdalene Laundries. Mary Lou MacDonald also stated, this report confirms what many of us here in this chamber have known for a very long time. Also stating, referring to the Magdalene survivors, they have waited and they have waited, and yesterday was the day. I'm going to play part of the clip here. The full clip is 10 minutes long, so I won't play it all, but you can find it on Sinn Féin's YouTube channel.
Well, Taoiseach, in your response, you have set out every reason why you should apologise. You believe the women, you recognise the wrong done to them. The report itself confirms yet again state complicity in that wrongdoing. You know all of this, and yet you refuse to apologise. I think that is extremely cruel of you. I think that is extremely cruel to the Magdalene women, who yesterday expected that their story would be fully validated, that you would in fact move to remove that awful stigma with which they have lived. By putting our hands up collectively, by the state putting its hands up and saying, you were wronged, we were negligent. And I have to wonder, Taoiseach, as to the real motivation for your failure to apologise, given that you believe the women's account and given that you tell us that you understand their distress. I hope your version of responsible government isn't one that simply seeks to circle the wagons to protect the state from any financial liability that might arise, and to simply cast the women's experiences to one side, because that would not be a very palatable version of responsible government, not just for the women, but for citizens right across this country now, watching in horror as they yet again hear another story of brutalisation within an institution and the state's relationship with those institutions, and the state's stubbornness in refusing to face head on its responsibilities to the victims.
Thank you.
You need to make the apology, Taoiseach. You're clearly not going to make it in the House this morning, so this is the second disappointment for everybody concerned. Can you indicate to us whether at any point you in fact intend to give a full and fulsome state apology?
Taoiseach.
Well, I'm certainly not going to rise to the bait of political opportunism that you put out here. You above all people, and the party that you represent have a lot to answer for in terms of cruelty, in terms of truth, and in terms of reconciliation. I'm not going there. I've said in answer to the leader of the Fianna Fáil party, yes, I see you, Deputy Ferris. I see you. There's some discussions about your activities in the last year or two.
So why no apology? The evidence is now publicly available. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that there was heavy state involvement. So why do you think no apology was given on the day the McAleese report was published? I have tried to think of some reasons in the interest of trying to give a balanced perspective. So let's look at some of these reasons. This is purely speculatory. Historical complicity. So acknowledging government involvement would mean accepting a significant role in perpetrating and facilitating the operation of the Magdalene Laundries, which could be seen as a failure to protect vulnerable citizens. Legal and financial implications. Admitting official involvement could have legal consequences, including the possibility of lawsuits and compensation claims from survivors or their families. Financially, compensating survivors and providing restitution for the abuses they endured could be costly for the government. And then damage to reputation. Accepting responsibility for the Magdalene Laundries could damage the reputation of the Irish government, both domestically and internationally. It might be seen as an indictment of the state's failure to protect human rights and provide adequate oversight of institutions. Ties to religious institutions. The Magdalene Laundries were run by Catholic religious orders. Acknowledging government involvement may raise more questions about the close relationship between the state and the Catholic Church in Ireland, potentially leading to more debates about the influence of the Church on state affairs. Cultural and social factors. In the past, there was a prevailing conservative and judgmental attitude towards women who were considered fallen or immoral. Admitting involvement with the Magdalene Laundries could have challenged these deep-rooted societal norms. I feel I'm missing something here. So back to the IDC report. Some records from the nuns were unavailable. So the data used for the IDC report does not include records to the Magdalene Laundries in Dunleary, for which no record survived, or to Galway, where only partial records survived. Although it has since transpired by an independent researcher, which I think we'll talk about later on, there were files in existence in the Galway Magdalene Laundry, which did not make it into the IDC report. We don't know why, because we don't have access. And it does not include entries to the Magdalene Laundries prior to 1922, and there were a lot of incomplete records. The resulting report is 1,000 pages long, and it did confirm state involvement. So this report is formed from records handed over from the nuns, archives from relevant state and non-state parties, and basically anyone the interdepartmental committee felt were anyway involved with the Magdalene Laundries or would have any records. At the release of the interim report, Justice for Magdalene's group met with Chair Senator Martin McAleese and gave him some suggestions as to where he might find some records when he asked for their input. The committee received around 800 pages of direct testimony from the actual survivors of the Magdalene Laundries through to Justice for Magdalene's group, outlining everything. This didn't make it into the final report, and Martin McAleese himself met with over 100 of the Magdalene Laundry survivors. However, there was over 60 of those still confined or being cared for by the nuns at the time that he spoke to them. The committee found that from available records, around 10,000 women are known to have entered the Magdalene Laundries between 1922 and 1996. It's unknown why young girls aren't counted here, or if they're to be presumed included in this figure of 10,012. It excludes those who entered before 1922 and remained thereafter. The state includes these girls and women who total at least 762, nominating them as legacy cases. It doesn't include records from two of the larger Magdalene institutions. The IDC found the youngest age of entry was 9 years old, and there were multiple records of 9-year-olds, plus many entries referred to just a young child or girl and left the age blank. The IDC report states that 879 women died within the laundries between 1922 and 1996. However, Claire McGettrick, an Irish Research Council postgraduate scholar at the School of Sociology at University College Dublin and co-founder of Justice for Magdalene's research, found that so far her research counts 1,838. The IDC report states the average time spent in a Magdalene laundry to be 3.2 years. Claire McGettrick finds that over half the women named in the 1954 to 64 registers for High Park and Donnybrook Magdalene Laundry remained in the institutions until their deaths. In the case of the Good Shepherd Magdalene Laundry in Limerick, an average of 60.4% of women named in the electoral register between 1961 and 1983 died confined in the institution. You can read more about Claire McGettrick's research and much more in this book, A Dublin Magdalene Laundry, available through jfmresearch.com. Taken from an article written by Kate Gleeson titled A Woman's Work is Unfinished Business, Justice for the Disappeared Magdalene Women of Modern Ireland, in determining the duration of stay and conditions of exit of inmates. The McAleese report was only able to use data provided by religious orders in relation to 42% of Magdalene women. For 58% of admissions, there was no exit date recorded, hence McAleese declared there to be no usable data relevant to determining the duration of stay or mode of exit of this cohort, even if it means they died behind those walls. There are no other state records. McGarr solicitors say on their website, the statistics are based on such incomplete and flawed data that they are essentially meaningless. The IDC report, or the McAleese report, it has been a controversial topic. The IDC did not have all the records, and we have no way of knowing how they reached the figures or any of their conclusions, as the files are not available to us. Establishing the facts of state involvement with the Magdalene Laundries from 1922 until 1996 was a huge task. The IDC were not experienced researchers. They undeniably worked hard with what they had. It took 18 months to complete. However, it was just to establish state involvement. Since its publication, many other people, including Claire McGettrick and Professor James Smith, have carried out research getting much different figures through alternative methods. But we do get some other useful information from the IDC report. For example, we never had access to the nuns' records before, so we get some case studies detailing how some of the girls and women, as recorded, ended up in the Magdalene Laundries in the first place. The survivors of the Magdalene Laundries did get a full state apology. when Taoiseach Enda Kenny finished the apology, the survivors of the Magdalene Laundries and the victims of the Magdalene Laundries got a standing ovation in the Dáil. I'm going to let the full apology play out if you would like to see it. I've given you a lot of information and quite a few figures, so I'm going to leave it there for this episode. There will be at least one more episode where we will dive into the McAleese report. As always, thank you for being here. It's an important topic. Keep talking about it, and I'll see you in episode 3.
To make a statement. Concordia. I begin today's debate by thanking Dr. Martin McAleese and his team for their excellent work on this report. I thank equally all of the women who met with them to assist in its compilation. I also thank the religious orders who cooperated fully with Dr. McAleese. Together they have helped provide Ireland with a document of truth. The Magdalene Laundries have cast a long shadow over Irish life, over our sense of who we are. It's just 2 weeks since we received this report, the first ever detailed report into the state's involvement in the Magdalene Laundries. It shines a bright and a necessary light on a dark chapter of Ireland's history. On coming to office, the government was determined to investigate the facts of the state's involvement. The government was adamant that these ageing and elderly women would get the compassion and the recognition for which they have fought for so long, deservedly so deeply, and had until now been so abjectly denied. The reality is that for 90 years, Ireland subjected these women and their experience to a profound and studied indifference. I was determined because of this, that this government, this Dáil, would take the necessary time not just to commission the report, but to actually study it, and having done so, to reflect on its findings. I believe that was the best way to formulate a plan and a strategy that would help us make amends for the state's role in the hurt of these extraordinary women. I'm glad that so many of the women themselves agreed with that approach, and I'm glad that this time of reflection gave me the chance to do the most important thing of all, to meet personally with the Magdalene women, to sit down with them face to face, to listen to their stories. I have to say it was a humbling and inspiring experience. Today, as their Taoiseach, I'm privileged to welcome some of these women to this House, many of whom have travelled long distances to be here. And I welcome you, every one of you, to your national parliament, to Dáil. What we discuss today is your story. What we address today is how you took this country's terrible secret and made it your own, burying it, carrying it in your hearts, here at home, or with you to England, to Canada, to America and Australia, on behalf of Ireland and the Irish people. But from this moment on, you need carry it no more. because today we take it back. Today we acknowledge the role of the state in your ordeal. We now know that the state itself was directly involved in over a quarter of all admissions to Magdalene Laundries, be it through the social services, reformatories, psychiatric institutions, county homes, the prison, the probation service and industrial schools. We have in fact decided to include all the Magdalene women in our response, regardless of how they were admitted. Dr. McAlee set out to investigate 5 areas in particular. Firstly, the routes by which women enter the laundries. Secondly, the regulations of the workplace and the state inspections. Thirdly, state funding of and financial assistance to the laundries. Fourthly, the routes by which the girls and the women left the laundries. And fifthly, death registrations, burials and exhumations. In all 5 areas, there was found to be direct state involvement. And as I read this report, and as I listened to these women, it struck me that for generations, Ireland had created a particular portrait of itself as a good living and God-fearing nation. Through this and other reports, we know that this self-flattering portrait is fictitious. It would be easy to explain away all that happened, all we did in those great moral and social salves of the culture back then, the order of the day, the terrible times that were in it. Yes, by any standards, it was a cruel, pitiless Ireland, distinctly lacking in a quality of mercy. That much is clear, both from the pages of the report and from the stories of the women that I met. And as I sat with these women, as they told their stories, it was clear that while every woman's story was different, each of them shared a particular experience of a particular Ireland, judgmental, intolerant, petty, and prim. In the laundries themselves, some women spent weeks, others months, more of them years. But the thread that ran through their stories at Cancorla was a palpable sense of suffocation, not just physical, in that they were incarcerated, but psychological, spiritual, and social. Their stories were enriched by an astonishing vividness of recall of situation and circumstance. Here are some of the things I read in the report and what they said directly to me. The work was so hard. The regime was cruel. I felt all alone. Nobody wanted me. They sent me because they thought I was going to a good school. I've seen those older people beside me. I used to cry myself to sleep. I was bold. I wasn't going to school. I was locked up. I thought I would never get out. We had to sew at night, even when we were sick. I heard a radio sometimes in the distance. We were not allowed to talk to each other. Your letters were checked. I was so short, I needed a stool to put washing in. The noise was desperate. I thought I would go mad from the silence. The heat was unbelievable. I broke a cup once and had to wear it hanging around my neck for 3 days. I always felt tired, always wet, always humiliated. My father came for me after 3 months, but I was too ashamed to go home. I never saw my mum again. She died while I was in there. The Magdalene women might have been told that they were washing away a wrong or a sin. But we know now, and to our shame, they were only ever scrubbing away our nation's shadow. And today, just as the state accepts its direct involvement in the Magdalene Laundries, society too has its responsibility. I believe I speak for millions of Irish people all over the world when I say we put away these women because for too many years we put away our conscience. We swapped our personal scruples for a solid public apparatus that kept us in tune and in step with a sense of what was proper behaviour or the appropriate view, according to a sort of moral code that was fostered at the time, particularly in the 30s, the 40s and the 50s. We lived with the damaging idea that what was desirable and acceptable in the eyes of both the church and the state was also interchangeable. And is it this mindset then, this moral subservience, that gave us the social mores, the required and the exclusive values of the time, that welcomed the compliant, the obedient and the lucky us, and banished the more problematic, the spirited or the unlucky them? And to our nation's shame, it must be said that if these women had managed to scale the high walls of the laundries, they would have had their work cut out to negotiate the height and depth of the barricades around society's proper heart. For we saw difference as something to be feared and hidden, rather to be embraced and celebrated. Were these our values, Count Corla? Because we can ask ourselves for a state, least of all a republic. What is the value of the tacit and unchallenged decree that saw society humiliate and degrade these girls and women? What is the value of the ignorance and the arrogance that saw us publicly call them penitents? Penitents for their crime of being poor or abused or just being plain lucky enough to be already the inmate of a reformatory, a psychiatric institution or an industrial school. We can ask ourselves, as the families we were then, what was worthy, what was good about the great euphemism of putting away our daughters, our sisters, our aunties? Those values, those failures, those wrongs characterized Magdalene Ireland. Today we live in a very different country with a very different consciousness and a very different awareness. An Ireland where we have more compassion, more empathy, more insight, more heart. We do because at last we are learning those terrible lessons. We do because at last we're giving up our secrets. And we do because in naming and addressing the wrong, as is happening today, we're trying to make sure we quarantine such abject behaviour in our past and eradicate it from Ireland's present and from Ireland's future. In a society guided by the principles of compassion and social justice, there never would have been any need for institutions such as the Magdalene Laundries. The report shows that the perception that the Magdalene Laundries were reserved for what was offensively and judgmentally called fallen women is not based upon fact at all, but upon prejudice. The women are, and always were, wholly blameless. Therefore, Count Corla, I, as Taoiseach, on behalf of this state, the government and our citizens, deeply regret and apologise unreservedly to all those women for the hurt that was done to them, for any stigma they suffered as a result of the time they spent in a Magdalene Laundry. I hope that the publication of the McAleese report and this apology makes some contribution to the healing process. But on reflecting on the report, I've come to the view that these women deserve more than this formal apology, important though it is. I also want to put in place a process by which we can determine how best to help and support the women in their remaining years. One of the many things I've learned during my recent meetings with the Magdalene women is that their circumstances and their current needs vary greatly from person to person. That's why the government has today asked the President of the Law Reform Commission, Judge John Quirk, to undertake a 3-month review to make recommendations as to the criteria that should be applied in assessing the help that the government can provide in the area of payments and other supports, including medical cards, psychological and counselling services, and other welfare needs. The terms of reference for Judge Quirk will be published later today, and will also arrange for the representatives of the women to be fully briefed on this process. When Judge Quirk has reported, the government will establish a fund to assist the women based on his recommendations. I'm confident that this process will enable us to provide speedy, fair and meaningful help to the women in a compassionate and a non-adversarial way. I am determined that the fund will be primarily used to help the women, as is their stated and strong desire, and not for legal or administrative costs. The McAleese report also refers to women who recounted similar experiences in other residential laundries, such as the laundry offering services to the public operated in the training centre in Stanhope Street in Dublin. The government has decided that these women should be included in both the apology I have extended today and in the fund. I'm also conscious that many of the women I met last week want to see a permanent memorial established to remind us all of this dark part of our history. I agree that this should be done. I would like to engage directly with the representatives of groups of as many of the women as possible to agree on the creation of an appropriate memorial to be financed by the government separately from the funds that have been set aside for direct assistance for the women. Let me conclude, Count Corla, by again speaking directly to the women whose experiences in the Magdalene Laundries have negatively affected their subsequent lives. As a society, for many years, we failed you. We forgot you, or if we thought of you at all, we did so in untrue and offensive stereotypes. This is a national shame, for which I say again, I'm deeply sorry and offer my full and heartfelt apologies. At the conclusion of my discussions with one group of the Magdalene women, one of those present sang Whispering Hope. A line from that song stays in my mind. When the dark midnight is over, watch for the breaking of day. Let me hope that this day and this debate, heralds a new dawn for all those who feared that the dark midnight might never end.
Oh.